I think, to your point of this sort of infantilizing the people of the African continent as well as the African diaspora, when you look at the bill, in many places, I saw 12 different places where it talked about influence. It was concerned about the influence of people on the African continent and in the African diaspora, and then also talked about people on the African continent and the diaspora manipulating people's opinions on what's going on in Ukraine, as if you cannot just take in information and make a decision on your own. So I want to pull out a couple of things, and Didier, I want to hear a little bit more about what you think about this bill.
Sure.
So HR 7311 says it wants to hold. It's titled "Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act." So why is there this focus on Africa? I'm not aware of any other continent that's being talked about in this context. To hold accountable the Russian Federation and African governments and their officials who are complicit in aiding such malign influence and activities. What does it mean, malign activities? What does it mean to aid? And why is the focus on Africa? Didier?
Well, Teylama actually took the longer view. I was thinking that he would leave that to the historian that I was. So he kind of stole my thunder. That's okay by actually taking the discussion all the way to the 18th century. With
by the way, he's my teacher, history
no,
teacher.
I am not.
That's okay.
I'm
a good student.
The teacher became the master, huh?
So yeah, absolutely. So that actually means that I'm a good teacher. So Hermela, malign is something, malign in Africa, we cannot actually put Russia in the mix. There are other countries that we can actually put in the mix. A place like France, for example, which has in the past for several centuries some really malign activities in Africa, exploiting, pillaging African resources, making sure that African cannot actually choose their leaders, replacing the father with the son. They've done that in several countries. Very recently, they did that in Gabon by replacing Omar Bongo with his son. They did that in Togo with Eyadema. They did that in Chad with Idriss Déby. Partly in Congo, DRC with Kabila the father and Kabila the son. They are actually preparing to do that in the Republic of Congo by replacing Sassou Nguesso with his son. So if we are really talking about a specific country that has had malign activities in Africa, Russia wouldn't actually come to mind. It would be France. I'd like to go back to the genesis, if you allow me, the genesis of this bill. To me, it's so really interesting that this bill was passed on April the 28th of this year, and it was actually sponsored by 17 people. It was a very bipartisan resolution with, I think, 5 Republicans and 12 Democrats. So if you look at the Democrats, that actually the person who introduced the bill is Christopher Meeks. I think he's a representative of the 5th District of New York. He's part of the Black Caucus. If you look at the other Democrats that actually sponsored the bill, co-sponsored the bill, many of them are actually part of the Black Caucus. And it's so ironical that Meeks said that the purpose of this bill was to protect Africa. Africa needs protection. And to me, it's so ironic, so interesting that they use the U.S. Congress Black Caucus to pass a bill, a resolution that's so detrimental to Africa. Isn't that interesting? Another part of this bill that's so fascinating, it took only 40 minutes to debate the bill on the floor of the U.S. Congress. 40 minutes for such an important bill. Just 40 minutes. Very, very interesting. And I think that I have to remind your readers, your followers, your netizens, that one of the reasons that the bill was passed is that there were 2 votes at the General Assembly of the UN. One vote was on March the 2nd. The other vote was on April the 7th. The April the 7th actually was meant to exclude Russia from the UN Council on Human Rights, which actually was done. you look at the people, the countries that abstain, it's not just African countries. It's a lot of Asian countries that are also abstained. We have China, we have Bangladesh, we have Armenia, we have Iran and Iraq, we have Vietnam, we have Pakistan, we have so many Asian countries, but yet we do not have a bill targeting those Asian countries. So the question that we have left with to really ponder is why Africa? And I think that going back to what Teylama said is this kind of infantilization. Africa is a different continent. It's a continent that we can bully. It's a continent that we can mistreat, we can pillage. And I think it's really time to stop. It's really time for that narrative, that social construct that Teylama so eloquently articulated. It's time for that construct to stop.
Yes, and the thing that I'm realizing, and I would like other people who are not from the African continent or don't have connections there, is these kind of bills go against what we all agree it means to be America, at least, or Americans, and at least in terms of the ideals. So having the freedom of speech when it comes to a conflict that the U.S. is involved in that is affecting Americans in so many different ways, why you cannot take part in that conversation, whatever it is that you think is un-American, but because, and this is just sort of a perspective, not so much a fact, but because it is a bill that's targeting the African continent, a lot of people turn a blind eye to it because they don't connect to it. I mean, in general, Africa is one of the most exploited places in the world, if not the most exploited place. And even in the most conscious rooms, sometimes you'll find people that just assume that Africa is just sort of inherently poor and that it's not because of all of this different intervention that happens from the outside that is arming opposition groups, which the South African minister did mention. And I was really just happy to hear her say the things that we all knew to be true out loud with the U.S. Secretary of State right next to her, which really gives the United States policymakers a chance to correct course or continue to go down the path and lose a continent of over 1 billion people, many of whom are young, a continent that is rich in resources. So I try to encourage folks that are not from the continent to really just think more critically about what your views are on Africa and why they may not be why it may be like any other place that has had intervention. And that's why there's this perception that Africa is poor and always at war. If we're all more involved in asking the questions as to why, then we'll find that it's very similar to what happens everywhere else. And these kind of bills should scare Americans, because I'm an American. I just happen to have roots in Africa, and that's true for many of us. So let's pull up a couple of things. I want to hear what you guys thought about other parts of the bill here. It talks about holding the African diaspora or anyone who influences the African diaspora, again, U.S. citizens in many cases, accountable. So it says anyone who manipulates African governments and their policies, as well as the public opinions and voting preferences of African populations and diaspora groups, including those in the United States. Teylama, when you read that, I thought that was one of the most eerie elements. When you read that, what were your first thoughts?
But once again, is the sense that we are being told what to do. We are children. They will not talk like this to any other groups but us. And I want to go back to some of this point that Didier just mentioned. When we talk about Russia, malevolent, right? Russia, malign, to whom? Malevolent to whom? Do African countries, African people do not know what is good for themselves? They have to be told by Europeans about America what is good for themselves? That is really a concern for me. For what, as I'm looking at the continent of Africa, right? The fundamental question that I'm asking to myself, and as I read this resolution, is that who is really the malevolent power on the continent of Africa? Didier just mentioned that, talked about it, but I want to go to a deeper extent to it. First of all, it's important for me to state that I am not a pro-Russia. In fact, I'm an American citizen, as you said, who has roots on the continent of Africa. And I believe in the values of justice, equality, the pursuit of happiness, democracy, and all the values that have made America a great country. Therefore, I'm not choosing for any side here, except that I'm looking at for the betterment of the continent of Africa that is being abused. The one thing I want to remind people here is this: Russia has never colonized a single African country. Russia did not sustain a neo-colonial influence, right, on the continent of Africa. To the contrary, Russia has helped some of the African countries to get their independence. Russia did not sign a colonial pact, right, with its former colony in Africa to keep those colonies in bondage even after so-called independence. Russia did not participate in the elimination or assassination of leaders that were considered, African leaders that were considered too bright, right, too independent-minded in the mind of the former colonial power. Russia does not maintain 14 African countries today that are paying 50% of the foreign currency reserves. 50% of the foreign currency reserve. Right now, there are 14 African countries. When they sell oil, right, for $1 billion, half of that money have to be placed in some foreign bank. And I'm going to tell the name, the French bank, the Central French Bank. Half of the money. It used to be 100% before. And that was established by the colonial pact. We remember leaders, president like Sékou Touré from Guinea, who, when he was given the choice between to continue to be under the French influence, who he felt like he was under slavery, he stated the following: we prefer freedom to poverty we prefer freedom in poverty to opulence in slavery. And then what did the French did at that time? They basically attempted military coup against him to remove it, and they flooded his economy by fake currency in the country. I'm going to give you a few names of people, leaders of the continent of Africa that were visionary, but all of them have been eliminated. I take Sylvanus Olympio, first president of Togo; David Dacko, first president of Central African Republic; Maurice Mayemgo, first president of Burkina Faso, which was Volta at the time; Modiba Keita, first president of Mali; Hubert Menga, first president of Benin. All those leaders were removed by ex-French legionnaires because they didn't agree with some of the colonial policy French was trying to put on these African countries. In fact, Sylvanus Olympio, who was a brilliant economist, was killed 3 days after his country decided to create its own currency. So what I'm simply saying to you is this: if there is a nation that has been malevolent, malign, is not Russia. It is France. And as you remember, when we met, you and I, during that meeting we had with Karen Bass, this is one of the comments that I made to Ms. Bass, was that if you really want to protect Africa, there's a particular nation that has been the most destructive, the most malevolent, predatory nation on the continent of Africa, and that is France. But here's what was the answer. Oh, we cannot pass a resolution against France. Why not? The African leaders, African young men today, as you said, we're going to become the youngest population on the continent. 70% in 2050, 70% of those who are going to be less than 25 will be on the continent of Africa. Our continent is rich and has a lot of young people. We need to guide them properly as we're dealing with, there's a new scramble on the continent of Africa. And some of our leaders have gone to the US. They have attempted to reach out to the US to say, hey, we want to work with you. We want to stand on your side. But here's what they told us. The US said, well, we cannot go against the French because you guys were colonized by the French. So therefore, we don't want to infuriate the French. So what is the choice of the African continent that is trying to free itself from bondage, from centuries of bondage, right? We have to continue to die. We have to continue to be killed so French people can have the dress, they can have the cheese and croissant in the Champs-Élysées. How many African children will continue to die for us to be free from the grip of colonization that the French have imposed on us? France has never left the continent of Africa. They are still there, destructive. And the US now is telling us we cannot go to Russia, we cannot work with China because they have malevolent interest. Come on, that need to stop. And you and I, us members of the African diaspora, we have a say on what needs to be done.
Hey everybody, please support independent journalism by going to patreon.com/HermelaTV and becoming a member. Thank you so much for your support.